Good evening, everyone. Yes, Angela asked me just to give a bit of global context. I anticipate that I'm speaking to a very well-informed audience, and I anticipate that you probably know quite a lot about fair trade, about different kind of ethical schemes. So this evening, for example, we had M&S this evening. When thinking about those kinds of options, I suppose, as churches, as well as individuals, I just wanted to kind of talk through some of the considerations that we might have. So as Angela mentioned, my name is Helen Dennis. I work for the Fairtrade Foundation. I actually work more broadly on trade policy, but I'm with colleagues who are working on a daily basis on a lot of these kind of supply chain issues. So I wanted to just give the global picture. I think, again, some of these statistics will probably be familiar to many of you. The thing that I've found particularly shocking has been more learning about modern slavery and the risks on my doorstep. And I think many of us have been familiar with some of this scandal across the globe. So globally, 40 million people trapped in some form of modern slavery, and 25 million of those in forced labour. I thought I'd also mention child labour. This is different because it happens generally within the context of family. And this is generally about families that just cannot generate a decent livelihood for themselves. And so children are finding themselves being often taken out of education, working on the farms. As I said, most in agriculture. And there are some supply chains that as fair trade we work with, such as cocoa, where child labour is really endemic, and it's a real kind of systemic problem to really get to grips with. But just going back to forced labour, domestic servitude was mentioned earlier, obviously in the context of thinking about modern slavery in the UK. Globally, it also accounts for the largest percentage, if we were looking at different sectors, of people who are trapped in modern slavery, in forced labour, but also construction, manufacturing, still agriculture as well, which is where we work primarily. But there's a whole load of other sectors where people are being vulnerably exploited. And then where in the world? The statistics are different depending on what aspect of modern slavery you're really looking into, but forced labour prevalence is highest in Asia and the Pacific. Across all types of modern slavery, the prevalence is higher in Africa. But forced labour you find occurring more in that region, but then also followed by Europe and Central Asia. So that just echoes that this is obviously an issue that we find in all parts of the world. And again, some of these issues have already been elaborated on in a UK context. What do we really mean by modern slavery? That deprivation of liberty. That can be the withholding of wages, threats of violence. Again, we heard about people who have been subject to violence, perhaps if they've tried to escape. Not just physical violence towards oneself, but also threats against the family. There are significant people who are kept in debt bondage, and therefore, have those threats. They can't see a way of getting out of that because you're never going to be able to make the money back that is needed in order to kind of pay back the loan shark or the person who you are in bondage to. Some of the kind of really horrific stories that you hear about people physically being locked into living quarters. So a whole load of different scenarios, and obviously we heard as well earlier about documents being withheld, so people who have had to give over passports as well. There we go. I think, there we go, prawn curry for dinner. I wanted to just give a few examples of quite complex supply chains that we might not necessarily be aware of. I mean, these are quite well-known cases, so you may have read about these in the newspaper at various points. One of the sectors which is particularly notorious for modern slavery is seafood, shellfish. And there have been various investigations into prawns and shrimp that have been, on our shelves in major supermarkets in this country that have been produced essentially by slave labour at some point in the supply chain. This was a case that arose from a 2014 investigation which found that a company called CP Foods had slave labour in their supply chain. It was essentially from the fish meal that was being kind of trawled to then feed the prawn. So it's, when we think about the kind of supply chain, there are these different stages, and one of the challenges is that companies are maybe getting better at maybe at a factory level, understanding what's going on at that point, but they might find it harder to trace every tier of their supply chain. In this instance, I mean, it was people who were trapped on fishing boats, it was people who had migrant workers, a familiar story, in this case from Cambodia and Burma, working in Thailand. You hear stories of people in this industry who are essentially trapped at sea. So again, a real physical entrapment, unable to escape. In this case, again, 20-hour shifts, physical violence, in some cases even killing of people reported when people were seen as unfit to work. They were got rid of. This is really shocking. I still find it shocking reading through it that this is happening and that's the food that we're eating. There was also a 2015 report of shrimp that was being peeled by slave labourers as well, often women in this case. There has been a lot of action, or at least talking, that has arisen from these cases. But even just this year, Human Rights Watch published a report saying that slavery is still pretty endemic in this sector, it is still persisting. So there are efforts to get people around the table to improve levels of transparency, to get the government, the Thai government in particular in this case, to take more action. But as we've heard, even in a UK context, how difficult it is when you have criminal gangs, essentially, that are getting around the system, that are preying on vulnerable people. And you just think about that in a context maybe where a government has even less resources, where there may be corruption, there may be other issues. It's very, very difficult to address these challenges. Another example is, I just wanted to mention, was cotton. There's been a lot of focus, quite rightly, on the garment industry, particularly in the wake of the Rana Plaza disaster 5 years ago, which killed over 1,000 people, again, mostly women who were working in garment factories for very well-known brands in Bangladesh. But what we often forget is that actually that's a very kind of long way down the supply chain already. And if you're thinking about a cotton t-shirt, for example, you're not just thinking about the factory conditions. You have people who have been ploughing the fields. You've got people who have picked the cotton, essentially. Then it goes to a ginning factory. Then it goes to be spun and woven. You have people dyeing the fabric. And you have all of these different stages before you even reach the factory. And cotton pickers are particularly vulnerable. One of the perhaps more unique aspects of kind of exploitation in the cotton sector is that it's actually state-sanctioned forced labour in the cases of a couple of countries. Very well known that forced labour has essentially been used by the state in both Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And various retailers like H&M have announced bans on cotton from Uzbekistan and now Turkmenistan and Syria as well, where these issues have been very persistent. Again, there have been positive statements from governments saying that they are really clamping down on this, that it's not something that they would sanction, but the evidence on the ground that comes through from human rights organisations indicates that actually this is still a problem. So again, when we're thinking about not just the food that we're buying, but the clothes that we're buying as well, there are some really complex issues that we need to get to grips with. So one of these issues is just the complexity of supply chains. If you think about that t-shirt and all the stages that it goes through, if it then maybe has like some beads on it, then there's another risk there that it's been subcontracted, so maybe home workers as well, which is another completely deregulated sector. And the governance, global governance, has just not caught up with this, with the complexity. We have a continual race to the bottom on price. It's all about price for consumers. That's the dominant narrative. And in some respects, you can understand it. There are many people living, in our communities who can afford, nice things from shops they may not have been able to afford in previous years. But there is a cost to, particularly fast fashion, where we're seeing really high turnover of different ranges, for example, on the shelves of retailers. Essentially, if you think about it, how are they delivering that in bulk at such a fast pace? It's because they may be requiring very quick turnarounds, and that will increase the risk, again, of things being subcontracted, and then you just have no idea who's actually carrying out that work and how they're managing to do it in such a quick time at such low cost. There are also environmental factors that are driving this. So in the Thailand example, this is in a context of declining fish stocks. The work is becoming much harder, and yet the drive for the same profit is still there. So it's also worth thinking about the environmental aspects. And then this is something which is in our, I'm sure on our minds on a regular basis, which is actually, what is the context which enables this to flourish? These kind of dehumanizing attitudes towards particularly migrant workers, people who are kind of seen as the other, people who are in our communities but who we're maybe not engaging with. All of these things lead to a context, whether it's in the UK or globally, where modern slavery can flourish. The Modern Slavery Act has been mentioned. I won't dwell on this too much, but it did include measures to increase transparency in supply chains, as well as establishing the Modern Slavery Commissioner and a number of other kind of key provisions. So it means that all companies now with a turnover of more than 36 million must produce a modern slavery statement. It needs to be on their website. It needs to be signed off at board level. This is a fairly new provision. Unfortunately, the work that's been done so far indicates that a significant number are not actually complying with the Modern Slavery Act, and many of the statements are very poor. It's quite challenging to actually look at the compliance of companies around the Modern Slavery Act, because there isn't a central depository for statements at the moment. But there are some NGOs like the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre who are doing some really excellent work around this and really trying to trawl through all of the statements and looking at which companies have still not produced them and put pressure on them. No prosecutions under the TIS clause yet. And also, I found this, completely shocking, that actually a lot of central government suppliers, 40% of central government suppliers themselves are non-compliant with the Act. So there's still a really big enforcement job to do to ensure that contracts are not being given to companies that are not complying. Essentially, that it's illegal not to comply with the Act. So there are questions which arise from this, of course, about whether or not we need stronger legislation. Interestingly, in Australia, they are bringing forward their own Modern Slavery Act at the moment, and they're looking to learn from some of the areas where the UK Act has been weak to try and strengthen those provisions. So hopefully we will see that legislation coming through, and there will be a kind of move to look at how we might be able to strengthen the UK Act as well. Fair trade as a response to modern slavery. I would say that what we're trying to do, it's not just a negative response, by which I mean, where is there modern slavery, and where do we need to take kind of enforcement action, where are there criminal prosecutions needed, etc. But it's about trying to create an environment, a positive response, where we're thinking about the conditions that people need to actually thrive at work. So, for example, looking at the enforcement of rights at work, working towards living wages in supply chains. And I think that is important, because ultimately modern slavery is the most extreme end of labour exploitation, and there is a lot of other forms of labour exploitation in our supply chains, which we may not meet that definition of modern slavery in terms of deprivation of liberty, but actually where people are being exploited, there might be sexual harassment in the workplace, they may still be receiving very, very poor wages, and actually we want to kind of look at the whole suite of things that we can do to address that. Obviously, fair trade works in some sectors which carry risk. I've named a few there: cotton, cocoa, sugar and tea. It's interesting thinking about the historic links as well to slavery, because obviously if you think about something like sugar, I mean it just shows you how persistent the form is different now, but where there has been historic exploitation in supply chains, we still haven't been able to get to a point where we have just trade in those goods. We aim to mitigate the risk through enforcement of standards, but also payment of additional money, premium to workers so that they can invest that in things like health and education, secure a minimum price, which we hope will then filter down to wages as well. But there's other support around fair trade, and obviously other NGOs would be doing these things as well. For example, establishing savings and loans groups that mean that people don't have to go to dodgy lenders all the time. And we're very conscious that it's not enough, that fair trade is part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. And we also need wider advocacy efforts and interventions to bring about system-wide change. And I mentioned child labour in cocoa. We can do our part and we can try our best. But at the moment, the amount of, say, tea or cocoa which is traded on fair trade terms compared with what the global consumption of those goods is really small. So we have to be realistic about the leverage that we have as well. Probably spoken far too much. So I think these are some just fairly obvious things. Obviously, my main message to you would be to use your purchasing power as individuals, but also, as I said, maybe as small groups. If you're buying some, coffee or tea for your small groups or churches, who are you buying that from? Educate yourself around companies that maybe have signed up to things like the Ethical Trading Initiative, which isn't perfect, but it is a baseline, and it means that companies that have signed up to that are committed to producing annual reports around their ethical practices. Supporting positive alternatives. Fair trade is one example. Lots of companies that will be familiar to people here, like Tradecraft, Divine Chocolate, that have a social mission really embedded within their organisation. If at all, I just put this in as a question mark, you're in a church that actually does have contracts or kind of procurement, you might have kind of preferred caterers that you bring in for big functions or things like that, then are those companies complying with the Modern Slavery Act? So as I said, I mentioned M&S earlier. M&S have produced a really good, excellent statement for the Modern Slavery Act. That's just one example, but it's always worth just checking. We're not running any big campaigns around this at the moment, but of course it's always worth contacting your elected representatives. I put MPs down here, but you might also want to contact local councillors if there are particular issues of concern in the locality as well, just to show that you care and to keep this very much on their agenda. So I will stop there, but hopefully that's some food for thought.